Your life.
Very well. Good evening, everyone, especially people who are in this meeting right now and people who have joined from India. Welcome to the Professor Ved Nanda Fellowship Training Seminar. We have weekly seminars, and this is an important area of activity for International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. Just for the sake of record, this is our logo for ICHRRF. On behalf of the Board of Directors and Executive Team of the ICHRRF, I do invite our audience to yet another seminar in the ICHRRF Ved P. Nanda Fellowship Training Program in Human Rights. We started this fellowship training program from January 1st, 2022. And this is our distinguished faculty that includes Professor Ved P. Nanda, Professor Yashwant Pathak, Professor Nalini Rao, Professor Lavanya Vemsani, myself, our Executive Director, Mr. Carl Clemens, Mr. Hardam Tripathi, Esquire, our Legal Director, Dr. Yashodhan Agolgaonkar, and Professor Nidhi Shendurnikar. We have currently only one fellow, Ripudaman Pachori, as part of Ved Nanda Fellowship Training Program in Human Rights. For our weekly seminar series, we have a standard format. Generally, there's a 25 minutes presentation by the fellow. Our chief mentor, Professor Ved Nanda, in whose name we have started this fellowship, he likes to then give 10 minutes comments and then 25 minutes discussion by the preceptor. And the last 30 minutes are for questions and answers. This is our standard format. However, in today's seminar, we will be deviating from this format, and I'll explain that to you. So what's the topic for our presentation today's seminar? Global Perspective on Human Rights of Police and Security Forces. Our seminars are generally on Friday evening 9 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. Eastern Daytime in United States, and this comes to around 6:30 a.m. in India to 6:30 a.m. to 8 a.m. on Saturday morning in India. So as I said, today's seminar topic is Global Perspective on Human Rights of Police and Security. The fellow today is supposed to present is Mr. Ripudaman Pachori, and his faculty preceptor for today's seminar is Mr. Carl Clemens. I have some announcements before we start the actual seminar. One of the fellows who joined from January 1st was terminated recently for various reasons. We have 2 fellowship applications pending. One of the person who is interested, Anushri Gisard, actually is joined for this seminar, so she gets a feel of our seminars. We did complete last month a special hearing on Kashmiri Hindu genocide in which 105 people joined. We had very wide coverage, especially in India. There were more than 69 outlets that covered our program. Also, Professor Arvind Sharma joined as member of the International Advisory Board. We are still calling for applications for July 22nd batch of fellows. The last date of application is May 15th, 2022, and we are inviting volunteer faculty to join the training program. There are a few housekeeping rules. We expect everyone to mute themselves to avoid noise interference. If you have a cell phone with you, please change it to vibration mode. Please don't try to interrupt our fellow or the faculty preceptor. If there are members of the audience who want to ask questions, they can ask questions by openly identifying themselves. All the questions are to be sent through chat function. Please be precise and specific in asking a question. Please don't send lengthy comments in the form of a monologue. And lastly, this seminar will be recorded and would be available on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. So with that introduction, we will start today's seminar. There's a special deviation from this format today. Professor Nanda is traveling, so he will not be there. Our fellow Ripudaman Pachori is not doing well and has not been able to prepare because of some medical issues. So we will start straight away from the faculty preceptor, Mr. Carl Clemens, who will give a presentation. Of course, since Ripudaman is here, I'm going to ask him some questions at the end, and then we'll have a discussion. So, Carl, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Adranji, and thanks, Ripudaman, for joining in spite of not being in the best of health. So I put together a few slides. The topic today is on methods of policing and how that affects human rights in a society, and especially in a democracy. This is actually a very critical area of research for ICHRRF. Some studies on policing in democracies and on human rights compare the police to coal miners at the coal face of society. It's where the legal system of society, which has a monopoly on violence, in Weberian terms, it's where the legal system hits the road, where the rubber meets the road. It's where the legal system meets the actual population that it's governing. And so just like you may have engineering recommendations for how you mine coal, ultimately it's the coal miners who are getting into the coal mine, who know the real nitty-gritty of what's actually happening there, the different layers that they have to go through, the gases that are being emitted, the dangers, the opportunities. And when the proverbial canary in the coal mine begins to sing, then no matter what the juggernaut of technique and engineering says, you got to get your people out of there. You have to retreat and make space, right? So the police really, and the discretion that it wields, can determine whether just following the law is helping the human rights of society, is maximizing the human rights of the maximum number of people in a society, or whether it is actually negatively affecting the human rights of the many. And in that sense, this is a very, very critical issue. It's also been a burning issue in the news across the world. Here in America, we've seen citizens groups like BLM or Antifa or other stripes of political militias go on the rampage in many cities, holding cities to ransom, sometimes for weeks and months. We've seen spikes in crime, and we've seen the police trying to interfere and restore order with almost military equipment. Not here in the United States, but also not just in the United States, but also here in Canada. We had it recently in Ottawa. We've seen it in Europe, especially with the influx of refugees. We saw it in India last year and across Asia and many countries that have been affected by conflict. The police and the way it continues to maintain law and order or introduce a new order has come into question in many parts of the world. So let's just take a look at the international framework and the recommendations it makes for policing, and what some of the trends are, and what some of the recommendations to improve things are like. So I threw a few slides together. Let's take a look at them. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know when you're able to see.
Yes, we are able to see.
Wonderful. So the global perspective on human rights of police and security forces. So I'll start off with the example that just happened in New York, where there was a subway shooting. A mass shooter comes into the New York subway and sprays a few bullets. A handful of people caught in the crossfire. And you had you had criticism of the police, saying that where were the police? Where was the New York? Where was the NYPD? They were nowhere to be found. And apparently the cameras, the security cameras, weren't working. But probably the same people a few months back, they were criticizing the police for being in the subway. They were saying, "What's the police doing in the subway?" I mean, it's an over-policed society. In fact, in general, the narrative in America for the last few years has been too much police. We need to reduce the number of police in our societies. So it's this dialectic that's happening, and we'll look at today's topic in view of that dialectic, and then hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion. So the need here in terms of human rights and policing is for accountability, for integrity, and for oversight. That means whatever action the police take, they have to explain it, and they have to answer all questions related to the situation in which they decided to take certain actions, especially the use of force or the delay in providing a free and fair trial. There has to be integrity. A police force that is corrupt means that the entire nation is going to be corrupt. And corruption can be in two forms. One is the police abusing its powers. And secondly, corruption in terms of recruitment and who gets to be in the police force, which sections of society are represented in the police force. The third is to have an oversight, an ombudsman that can keep the police force and the legal system honest. Because very often the legal system is not directly elected by the people and can almost begin to act as a power unto itself. So let's take a look at some of the problems we are facing. Look at the rates of police brutality. The Small Arms Survey, which is a Switzerland, Geneva-based organization, it says that each year, this is an older survey, each year between 2007 and 2012, an estimated 19,000 people were killed during police encounters or legal interventions. And they're looking basically mainly at the Western world. A lot of data is not available from wide swaths of the world. So we're looking at countries that are usually considered, having their own, a good system of law and order. Look at other statistics in 2019. This is just before COVID. So during COVID, you don't have a lot of statistics available. Just before COVID, 2019, police in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, its biggest city, they killed over 1,800 people. That's an average of 5 people being killed by Brazilian police per day in just their biggest city. In the same year, in Kenya, this is in Africa now, you're going outside the Western world, police killed 122 people. That's kind of interesting if you do the comparison. It's comparatively a lesser police. It's not as highly policed a society, and the number of people killed by the police is comparatively less. It's not small, but it's still less. Between October 2019 and Jan 2020, just a few months, that'll be just the three to 4 months, police in Iraq, a country that continues to see conflict, killed around 600 protesters within the space of 3 months. So that's another example. Then you have Jamaica. Again, this is in the Americas. Between 2015 and 2018, over 500 people were fatally shot by the police, and over 300 shot and injured. So a total of 800 people who were casualties of police fire, the majority of them fatals. And in the United States, country that we live in, on an average, the number of people killed per year is 1,000. This is by far the highest in any Western democracy. It's way above number 2, which happens to be Canada. So now let's look at the overarching instruments, the international instruments that guide the conduct for law enforcement officials. So in 1979, the General Assembly of the United Nations, it referred to this whole set of pre-existing instruments when it came out with its recommendations for law enforcement. So you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is your basic human rights. Then you have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, because a lot of police suppression is used against civil and political disruptors or people who are protesting. There's the Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from being subjected to torture. There's the UN Declaration on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. A lot of police brutality is directed at certain ethnic minorities or ethnic sections of the population. So there's a lot of racial and ethnic and religious discrimination that is involved in police brutality. Similarly, there's the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Then there's the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. This is where you have, by law, a society that separates and discriminates against one race from another or one religion from another. Then there is the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. We see a lot of it happening in places like Bangladesh, where the police doesn't necessarily protect minorities from a systematic program of ethnic cleansing. Then we have the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. So a lot of police brutality does not happen in public, but it happens behind the high walls and the barbed wire of the prison system, where people are completely at the mercy of the police and away from the television cameras. And finally, you have the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. Reason is there are migrants from one country to another, there are refugees, there are non-nationals living in a second country, and sometimes they face the brunt of police unfairness or discrimination. So specifically on the use of force, the recommendations should be familiar to anybody living in a democracy. So any physical force is to be used only when strictly necessary. And in fact, there are documents by the High Commission for Human Rights, the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights, where they go into great detail about what those circumstances may be. So they don't keep the language vague, but rather it goes into quite a bit of detail. The use of force by law enforcement officials should be exceptional, it says. For instance, for the prevention of crime or in effecting or assisting in the lawful arrest of offenders or suspected offenders. And it should be used only if they clearly show that they are about to use force themselves. There's no doubt about it. And in that sense, there is a principle of proportionality. So when we see videos in the United States of a cop stopping a car and a female driver getting out of the car and starts screaming at the cop, and then the cop, tackles her to the ground, handcuffs her, and puts his knee into the small of her back. That may be a fine display of jiu-jitsu, but it's definitely out of proportion with anything that she's done. So there has to be a use of force that's proportional to what the situation demands. The use of firearms specifically is considered an extreme measure. It should not be used except when a suspected offender offers armed resistance or otherwise jeopardizes the lives of others. So a trigger-happy cop is dealt with at length in these papers. Maintaining benign confidentiality of information obtained. This is really interesting. I mean, you have highly policed societies all across the world in different systems of government, democracies versus dictatorships. For instance, in China is a very highly policed society, and they have a system of social credit, wherein if they find that your behavior is not to their liking, then everything you try to do in life, whether it's getting a loan, trying to buy a house, getting a job, will be affected by the credit that the legal system gives you. It's just kind of it's a form of social credit, and it would cripple any and every aspect of your life. So the information that the police has on you is not kept confidential. You don't have your right to privacy. Rather, it is sent to every institution that affects every single aspect of your life. Recently in Canada, we had truckers besieging the capital because of the vaccine mandates. And Prime Minister Trudeau and his police force, they started to photograph all the protesters. And they have not just threatened, but they have followed through with basically introducing a system of social credit where they're saying that their financial accounts would be frozen. Their credit history, everything is going to be affected by just them participating in a democratic protest. So many people would say that Prime Minister Trudeau has crossed the Rubicon, and it should be a matter of great concern to people who are looking at what's going on. Next, we have that never instigate or condone the use of degrading treatment. So even if you're stopping and questioning somebody, or stopping and search, any kind of degrading treatment meted out to people is highly discouraged. And the reason for this is very, very important. And we look at it in a future slide. That does the police operate in a response mode, or does it operate in a prevention mode that is based on social trusteeship? Next, we have the police should actively work with medical agencies and provide medical help whenever there happens to be a use of force. There's a document by the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross or the Red Crescent, that details that a lot of the cases where it is called to operate are in areas where there is police brutality. And not only do they deplore the excessive use of police brutality, but they also say that the police often does not cooperate with them so that they can come in and provide succor to those who are being affected by the brutality. And finally, we have a serious view of the corruption within law enforcement. So one aspect of the corruption, as I mentioned, is where the police use unfair means, or they use brutal force, but then their own systems of accountability are highly compromised, or they're working with corrupt politicians or maybe parts of the mafia or whatever it might be. That, of course, means that it hollows out the very foundation of law and order within a society. The second example of corruption is in terms of recruitment and responsibilities. If only one ethnicity within a society monopolizes the police force, then the police force becomes a weapon, a political weapon in the hands of that ethnicity to bully and to beat down the other ethnicity. Perfect example of that would be Guyana in the Caribbean, where the police force since colonial times has been completely monopolized by Afro-Caribbeans, and it is used with lethal effect upon the Indo-Caribbeans. It is used as a weapon to check the political influence of the Indo-Caribbeans. So that's another example of corruption. So in terms of policing and democratic freedom, so policing typically implies some form of restriction. And how does that comport with freedoms in democracy? So from the High Commission for Human Rights, United Nations, it says the limitation on the exercise of rights and freedoms shall be only those necessary to secure recognition and respect for the rights of others, and for meeting the just requirements of morality, public order, and the general welfare in a democratic society. So the goal of policing, while it may restrict the human rights of some people who are creating disorder, it should maximize, for the long term, the human rights of the maximum number of people within the society. Everyone has the rights to freedom of opinion, expression, assembly, and association. So every action the police takes sets a precedent. It's a psychological precedent in the minds of the population that, okay, right now the police is curbing the freedom of opinion or expression or assembly of certain people based on some pretext, it would make the rest of the population less likely to assemble and associate and protest or voice an opinion in future in a completely different context. So the psychological aspect of this needs to be borne in mind. What are the other principles of law enforcement? One is non-discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or vocation. Vocation is kind of important. For instance, how are prostitutes treated by police? The police should be available as a shelter for prostitutes who often face a lot of abuse from clients or potential clients. But very often they face even more abuse from the police system, right? Just on account of their vocation. So non-discrimination across the board and a free and fair trial, all your Miranda rights, right to a lawyer and so forth, all of that comes under this. Then police arrests and investigations should not violate the security of a person and their privacy. The person, his or her household, his information should be treated with all the rights, all the human rights envisaged by the United Nations. Similarly, pre-trial detentions shall be the exception rather than the rule. In other words, throwing people in jail until a date can be found for their trials, it should not be the rule. They should be released immediately if a trial is not possible soon. Civil disorder is to be handled under all regular human rights principles. This is important in this day of color revolutions and astroturfed protests. This is kind of especially important. We have separate arrangements for detention of women and juveniles. It's very important. Again, this is within the prison system, the abuses that occur. It's important to have very clear and different rules and spaces for different types of prisoners. Refugees and non-nationals are entitled to all human rights of a country except certain political rights. And if they happen to be within the country unlawfully, then certain basic restrictions on movement may be allowable, but generally they should have all the other rights. So for instance, we have examples of police in France during COVID. They just rounded up all their migrant gypsy population and kicked them out of the country. Nobody asked any questions. And, in the middle of the cold winter and with a pandemic raging, these people were left completely exposed to the elements and the pandemic. Finally, non-corruption. The recruitment, hiring, assignment, and promotion policies of police agencies shall be free of any form of unlawful discrimination. We just talked about the example of Guyana. So Theodore Roosevelt, talking about this paradox that police have to face of maintaining order while at the same time maximizing human rights, especially in a young society where there's a lot of ideological currents that are going. There's a flux going on. The economy sometimes goes down, up and down. He says, order without liberty and liberty without order are equally destructive. And that's the fine line that police have to tread. So policing is legal realism. It's the legal system in action, giving life to laws that are at once substantive, procedural, and restorative, and concerned with legality, but also with due process, right? So the police, yes, they may do everything according to the letter of the law, but they have to give the citizens the right of due process, no matter what is being done. There has to be a process for everything. Nothing can be skipped, right? And ultimately, it should not just be the letter of the law, but it should be the substance. It has to be substantive, the spirit of the law, which is to maximize the human rights of the individual citizens. There's a wonderful document on this, dealing with this delicate balance. What are the rights of citizens with respect to the police, as well as the rights of police with respect to citizens? The document is by the Policing Institute, published in 2021. It's worth reading in full. One interesting diagram from that document is here's where we talk about policing through the intervention continuum. They call it the intervention continuum. That means the police basically functions in an interventionist role in the normal course of life in a society, which means that the police has to be plugged into society at all levels. A police should be available and accessible to all sections of the population and should have a friendly, cooperative relationship with all sections of society. Otherwise, what happens is that only then can it actually prevent crime and prevent the abuses of human rights. If we don't do that, then what happens is that police is always functioning in a response mode. So response mode is where it's stopping and interrogating, stopping and searching, bringing a warrant and, invading people's property, arresting people and interrogating them or slapping cases upon them. That does not, in the long term, make a society more safe. It does not make citizens feel like they have more freedom. It makes them feel like they're always being watched. They're always likely to be to meet the strong arm of the law, and it doesn't necessarily make the society feel like a more democratic place to be in. When we talk about prevention, however, we talk about police as advocates for human dignity. It's protecting vulnerable groups, especially the mentally ill, the homeless, victims, the endangered. The police is helping them. It's enforcing court orders. It's enforcing the court orders. So citizens feel safe when they do things through the legal system rather than go to a godfather outside of the legal system. It engages in community policing along with members of the community. It reduces fear. It is constantly involved in civic engagement, community crime prevention, building partnerships with other institutions in society, whether it is religious, faith-based organizations, or whether it is any kind of community organizations, community leaders. And it assures free movement throughout a society. So there should be no no-go zones within a society. So some countries, they have a low level of police brutality, like for instance, England and Wales, they have a low level of police brutality, but that's because the police turns a blind eye to no-go zones and criminal organizations that belong to certain communities, certain minorities. Like we had the famous case of the grooming gangs in the UK, mainly British, Pakistani grooming gangs. A lot of that was happening under the nose of the police, but the police did not do anything about it because of certain political dynamics in that country. So the police brutality is low, but the net effect on society is that the level of safety and cohesion within society was quite less compared to, for instance, Japan, which has a slightly less police brutality than even the UK, but where there are no no-go zones, there are no gangs that operate as a law unto themselves. So this is very important to understand prevention mode versus response mode. So national laws, international laws sometimes conflict or they're not in sync. And there's been a drive over the last 7-8 years across the world to try to bring national and state laws in line with international laws. So for instance, Mexico's new national law on the use of force does not limit. Sorry, Dr. Adanji, did you say something?
No.
Okay. So for instance, Mexico's law on the use of force does not limit the use of lethal force to situations where it is necessary to protect the lives of others. So it gives a free hand to the police. It does not require that officers use the minimum level of force to resolve the situation. So in a case like this, are the police going to obey the national law or the international law? It's clearly they're going to go by the national law. And that only undermines the international law. In the United States itself, 9 states have absolutely no laws at all on the use of lethal force by law enforcement officers. There's been a great push and there's been some progress in the United States, but the situation is far from ideal at this point. Very often we find that countries will shut down the doors of justice domestically, and victims have to then take recourse to international tribunals to seek truth, justice, and reparations. For instance, in France, we had cases of people from ethnic minorities, the France's Muslim minority, having to go to the European Court of Human Rights because they were denied justice within their own country. And the European Court did find French police guilty of murder, of extrajudicial killings, of keeping people in detention without any due process for much longer than they should have, and so forth. And then similarly, there are governments who routinely trample on other human rights like freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, and often authorized heavy-handed police responses to protests and demonstrations. And examples of those would be Iran, Iraq, Sudan. We saw it in Hong Kong and Nicaragua. And marginalized people, as I mentioned earlier, tend to be the most brutalized, because they're brutalized by society in general, and the police, instead of being a shelter for them, brutalize them even more. So for instance, LGBT people, homosexuals, and gay people around the world are typically subjected to routine harassment and abuse by the police, in particular in the Russian Republic of Chechnya. Just in 2017, authorities unleashed a wave of targeted attacks on people believed to be gay or lesbian. Dozens of gay men in Chechnya were abducted and tortured. Many were killed at secret detention sites. Now, Chechnya is supposed to be the model Muslim republic within the Russian Federation, and the views of Islam towards homosexuals are quite brutal. In the Dominican Republic, sex workers, and especially trans women who are sex workers, face appalling abuse at the hands of police, including rape, beatings, and humiliation. But again, this Dominican Republic is not an outlier. This happens even here in the United States. In fact, there are documentaries on it that you can find. So policing in different democracies. There's a good comparison report by the Council for Foreign Relations, a CFR report. And I've just shared a graphic here. You can see that the United States is just way above any other country. And the countries over here are all Western democracies. And then, of course, you have Japan as well, which is sort of considered Western. And as I mentioned, over here with England and Wales, they're at the bottom over here. Looks good on paper, but like I said, it's a cost of actual safety within society. Japan, on the other hand, provides a very good example of policing, because there the police is taught an etiquette of how to deal with members of the community at all levels of society. And members of the community, as they go through Japan's education system, are taught how to deal with police. And so there is a trusteeship that is promoted, which means that it becomes a very lightly policed society, and yet the crime rates are extremely low. So countries other than the US, they organize, fund, train, arm, and discipline their police officers differently than the United States. The United States, in terms of police spending, is about average. It's somewhere in the middle, actually. Many countries, including the United States, struggle with police brutality and tense relations between law enforcement and minority communities, especially. The United States far exceeds most wealthy democracies in killings by police, and officers seldom face legal consequences. So we'll wrap up with a couple of slides on what exactly is happening here in the United States, which is a sort of a model for the democratic world, and then some recommendations on what can change. Not a single United States state, a US state, complies with international law and standards on the use of lethal force by police. As we saw, 9 states have no laws at all about this, but not a single state complies with international law. The majority of deaths at the hands of police are the result of an officer using a firearm. In many cases, officers have shot people multiple times, indicating the use of force that was neither necessary nor proportionate. According to Mapping Police Violence, In 2019, Black people were 24% of those killed by the police, despite being only 13% of the population. The 1996 law authorizes the U.S. Department of Defense to provide surplus equipment to law enforcement agencies. This has resulted in police having equipment designed for military use to be deployed at protests. We saw that in Missouri, for instance. Civil society organizations have long been calling for police reform in the United States, and there are a few critical steps that could make everyone safer. So Congress and all 50 states should pass laws to limit lethal force by the police. And as I mentioned, this has made some strides in the recent years, but there's still some ways to go. The DOJ should collect and publish detailed, disaggregated data on people killed by the police so that we can understand which sections of the population tend to be easy targets for police violence. All cases of police use of lethal force should be thoroughly, independently, impartially, and transparently investigated, and those found responsible should be brought to justice. And the Department of Justice should conduct oversight of law enforcement agencies that have violated human rights. Now, that's one aspect of it, but there is also another aspect, which is that recommendations by the UNODC, ODC is the Office of Drug Control, offer a counterpoint to the above. In other words, the UNODC is actually recommending a greater use of I wanted to stop my screen sharing. So UNODC is actually recommending greater use of force and control in order to combat the drug problem. But on the other hand, even in their reports, they say that, well, this should be in line with all the other guidelines. So again, the police can be stuck between a rock and a hard place. We have to be sympathetic to that aspect of the police as well. But on the other hand, there's so much, there's a big other section of the pie that should really be low-hanging fruit. It should be something like, for instance, racial discrimination and discrimination against certain vulnerable sections of the population that should be low-hanging fruit that can be tackled very quickly. So I'll stop here and I'll hand it back to Dr. Adinji and we can have a discussion.
So I'm going to draw Ripudaman Pachori into discussion because I know that at least 4 or 5 weeks ago, he had presented a similar seminar on targeted killings of minority youth by US police. So I know you did not prepare for this seminar, but you have some expertise and residual knowledge. Would you like to make some comments on today's topic?
Yes, definitely. Thank you, first of all, Karlji. Thank you for covering me today. Especially in United States, I would like to say there are a couple of aspects, first of all, the kind of training the police officers get. Like for example, in academies here, there's a like 21 weeks of training period, whereas if you compare, some other countries in Europe or in India, officers has to go through about like 3 years of formal graduate training, and they graduate in their degrees in the field of law or social justice. And also have to work during their studies. They had to work with the local police as an intern to actually learn how to deal with different kind of situations, like protest or drug-related incidents or the family violence, etc. In United States, this has, because of lack of training, especially, we see that more and more incidents related to brutality towards minorities, especially in the Black communities. Karlji mentioned in his presentation, about 24% of the population is basically being affected by such kind of brutality. And if you study, look at the statistics, out of that, like every he mentioned that since like year 2000, there is a data since 2003 to 2010, there is an average 1,000 people being killed. In 2021, there were about 1,300 people killed. Out of those people, mostly the blacks, sorry, let me correct myself. So out of those people, um, uh, 4 out of 5 are mentally unstable people. So there's a lack of unarmed intervention, or the first responders are required, especially in the countries like United States, where they can basically um, mellow down the situation that has been arise, not because um, of the criminal bent of mind of a particular person, but also um, because of the other reasons. This situation, so this is one aspect. Another um, aspect is the racial discrimination. One example is with the Mexican community. They are seen as they are involved in drugs. So I have many friends where they have um, experienced that their family members are being stopped, um, um, you know, uh, on a regular basis when they are commuting from home to work, just because of their facial um, um, uh, their outlook, basically. Um, in other countries, you see, like in Russia, um, there's a lot of police brutality over there as well. Sometimes you are not even allowed to see the walls during commuting between one cell to another in the corridors, and it is uh, uh, pretty brutal over there. And appropriate laws need to be implemented, and police need to be trained appropriately. In Australia, however, it's very favorable for the criminals, actual criminals. Every criminal, it's a dreamland for every criminal. They International mafia. They do not want to get arrested in the countries like Russia or United States or Mexico. They want to retire in Australia because their prison system is so well designed. Um, that was on the lighter note. But you see, uh, in the context of police brutality based on the religion, especially, we have experience in Guantanamo Bay. We have experienced these kind of brutalities and undue arrest and violations in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We have also seen that there was a political um, um, line of thought when it was a matter of releasing some of the serious criminals which were arrested um, um, in a different part of the world, like in Afghanistan. However, that never happened in US in various situations. Um, the Another point I wanted to mention was the um, the type of trainings that I earlier mentioned, that the unarmed first responders are very much required. There are countries which train their police to use the other ways to handle serious um, conflicts without using the arms, like martial arts or um, basically negotiation techniques with the people which are involved in particular kind of activity or situation. There was in state of Wisconsin, there was a project called Mahout, um, and that was very successful. The project was basically there was a group of people who were um, in the social justice system as a negotiator. They were basically being called during the first as a first responder, and in like almost like 25% of cases, which were about 21,000 cases in that year, they responded and they basically de-escalated the situation. That model need to be implemented in various other states in United States. Um, yeah, I think that's all from my side. Adityanji.
Thank you, Ripudaman. Since we are a small group, I will invite various people to give their comments and perspective. It's a manner of great pleasure that our Director of Planning, Christina Boozer, joined the seminar today for the first time. So I will request Christina to give any comments she may have. Christina, please. Christina, are you there? Yes, yes. Please unmute yourself. Welcome to.
Hello. This is really powerful stuff, and I'm looking forward to the recording so I can share it with some social work colleagues. I'm sure they'll find the data alarming. And there's a lot of room for improvement. It reminded me of a patient that I had several years back who was a victim of police brutality. It was very sad. I worked very hard with next to no information because we couldn't have found proof of identity or proof of citizenship. So it was like really difficult to help this gentleman get placed. And he was really excited about his plans and his placement and the agency we were going to get him to work for. And the family, they might have been involved in potential human trafficking. It was not really family, we learned, and they called the police when he was not compliant. He did not want to go to the hospital. He did not need to go to the hospital. And evidently, I don't know what happened, but we saw it in the newspaper, the police killed him, and it was very sad.
Thank you, Christina.
Thanks.
About that sad story. I can understand your emotions. But again, welcome to ICHRRF with Nanda Fellowship Training Seminar Series. This is the first time you are, joining officially as Director of Planning. So welcome on behalf of ICHRRF. I see Professor Pathak is there. Professor Pathak, do you want to make any comments?
I just want to point out some things which are, I think, the other side of the discussion, because I am in Tampa, and in Tampa it is almost every day there are shootings, and there are certain areas where you really don't want to go after 9 o'clock. In such scenario, if the police, unless they use the force, the number of deaths might increase significantly, first thing. Same thing happens with many different towns. If you go to Chicago or Washington, D.C., I remember I used to be in Ann Arbor. In those days, Detroit was considered to be the murder capital of the world. And this is another area where the role of the police is to protect the people. And in that scenario, this type of brutality, whether what percentage is brutal and what percentage was needful to protect the people. So this is a thin line of demarcation, or it is challenging. But unless the state uses the police force for their political ending. Like you are seeing that in India now, that in many states in India, they are using police force to demoralize the opposition, demoralize the people. And this is a very political thing which happens in almost every country. And whenever the political, especially when it comes to a democracy, and if the politicians are not, with good character, then definitely they are going to use it. So my question is whether the police should be blamed for the brutality, or the politicians who are responsible for this type of brutality should be punished.
Thank you, Professor Pathak, for your poignant comments. Since we don't have very many people, I will use this opportunity to give my comments. And I'll give a much more global perspective. So if you look at the world, you have definitely democracy as one aspect, one pole, but you have countries that are authoritarian countries. And those authoritarian countries may be, whether they are like, political, ideological states, like China. It's a authoritarian communist authoritarian state. There are rulers that are despots, totalitarian. There are religious authoritarian states. So when we talk about civilized norms and international norms, it appears that they only apply to democracies. We need to make that distinction. So we are not able to compare apples to apples. We are comparing apples to oranges. Everybody knows that Russia is an authoritarian state, China is an authoritarian state. But so is Saudi Arabia. It is an authoritarian state. We generally don't talk about police brutalities in Saudi Arabia, or let's say in Iran or in Pakistan. These are religious despotic states where population has no rights, people just disappear, slightest crime or even a perceived crime, people may be put to death, or the population itself may assist the police in doing that. So that is one distinction. Second is level of policing. So United Nations studies suggest that the median level of policing is 300 police personnel per 100,000 population. Now, some countries have as high as 900 per 100,000 population. And actually, these are smaller countries. Whereas larger countries, if you look at United States, it is around 243 per 100,000. If you look at Britain, depending upon which country in the United Kingdom you're talking about, there are variations, but they are in high 200s. But if you look at China, the internal policing is only 142, 143 per 100,000. So although the level of policing may seem low because the population base is so large, but whatever policing is there, that is very brutal, very despotic. Similarly, like in India, the level of policing is only 151 per 100,000. So those are the variations one has to live by. Second is level of militarization of the police. Now, United States is unique in that, although by law, United States federal government cannot call the United States armed forces for domestic purposes, and only police forces can be used. But surreptitiously over a period of time, United States has started and has very successfully militarized the police. So you have local police departments that have, armored vehicles, almost tank-like situations. And they display them sometimes in police protests. I think there is United States geopolitical establishment always had a doctrine of US American exceptionalism. And I think there is indeed a doctrine of American exceptionalism. If you look at some of these, United States stands apart in militarizing the police in numbers of, death of civilians in police encounters, use of lethal force, use of brutal force. And Carl, you were comparing with British policing. The difference is twofold. British police is not militarized. The typical bobby is not allowed to carry firearms. So that is the difference. But yes, they have been wink, wink, nod, nod situation that certain gangs have been allowed to roam free. Why this situation you see in United States? Police being militarized and all that sort of thing. And Professor Pathak talked about the level of criminality. This is the only country that allows right to bear arms to the population. So your civilian population is heavily militarized. And if your civilian population can carry automatic firearms, machine guns, would you want the police force to match them? Or you would expect the police force to, just give up their lives? So these are very important questions because the United States is a very exceptional society. You have right to bear arms, you have right to create militias, which are beyond the law. So it creates a very crucible of social experimentation. The demands to defund police, wherever the demands were made, police stopped enforcing the law and the murder rate went up. So it's a very, very unique situation. And as a society, United States needs reforms at all levels, starting with Second Amendment. Because if you allow those lethal weapons in civilian population, then your police has to be capable enough to deal with that. So if you have violent gangs like Antifa or Proud Boys, does not matter what is the orientation or whatever, oath keepers or things like that. Or let's be very honest, KKK. So you have extremist organizations and then you have drug mafia, international cartels. In some of the southern states, the international drug mafia is very, very active. So level of police brutality becomes a counter reaction to the challenges on the street the police people face. State after state have, local police departments under Department of Justice consent decree because they found police brutality. But in a city like Cleveland, even after being on consent decree for last 7 years, police brutality continues. Now they are asking for a civilian board for police oversight and regulators that Department of Justice sends. So there are very unique challenges in democracies that I'm highlighting. I think we should not look this as a one-way kind of problem. It's not just the violence inflicted by police or security forces on the civilian population. It's the other way around also. So see what happened during Occupy movement in United States, what happened during some of the 2019, 2020 demonstrations under the banner of BLM. Under that banner, there were a lot of, anti-social elements that had the heyday because there were no go zones for the police, whether it was Seattle, Washington. And again, the epitome of police plight, sorry plight, is what happened to the Capitol Police on January 6th. So you have a society which is ideologically divided very strongly, and you have violence from every side. And you're seeing actually the conflict showing in number of deaths and all that sort of thing. I'm not condoning police violence or killings or this thing, but I think the society needs to do self-introspection and have nationwide reforms, because there are so much state-to-state variations in these problems. That is just United States, but there are other countries which have their unique challenges. What tends to happen in democracies, and I would not name countries, that in democracies, certain groups, certain criminal groups tend to exploit the democratic liberties. And exploitation and usurpation of those democratic rights to advance a totalitarian agenda that is very personal and private to those groups is basically challenging the state power, trying to do regime changes, trying to, change the system using the democratic safeguards. So when some of these police brutalities happen, I think we need to understand the other aspect also. So people may be, professing to be victims, playing the victim card also. Time and again, police officers are accused of excessive force, which when investigated, sometimes come true, sometimes not true. But in certain countries, police forces have been slapped, stoned upon, humiliated, especially when the police population ratio is low. False cases have been charged upon policemen of sexual harassment when nothing happened. Cases of rapes have been instituted against police personnel in certain countries. I won't name the countries. So there's a reality. And I think we should not automatically consider one class as oppressor and other class as oppressed, police as necessarily brutal. There are some very caring policemen also, but there are, bad eggs in every sphere, So we have to have a balanced view discussing human rights situations created because of policing and security forces. And then there is a totally, untouched area that we are not going to go into. That is when there is a civil disturbance, when there's a conflict zone, what is happening there in conflict zone? Although there may not be war, but there still may be a conflict zone. There may be armed insurgencies where police are supposed to tackle the situation. So we have to have a very broad overview. Ultimately, if you defund the police, you will have a very high crime rate. So sometimes slogans are raised to defund the police and all that sort of thing, just for political rhetoric, political gain, things like that. Ultimately, police are there to protect the population, the civil society. And yes, they play a very big role like in any institution, there are always corrupt people, and it is the onus lies on the society itself to have regulatory mechanisms to safeguard, to prevent abuse. In any system, there will be abuse. You will never have a fail-safe system. So we have to temper the facts of police brutality against the level of violence in a particular society. Mr. Clemens, you did mention about the example of Japanese police. Okay. You have to see what kind of disciplined Japanese society is. You know, it's culture shock. You will have supermarkets open. Nobody touches anything. You know, these electronic gadgets, beautiful electronic gadgets displayed openly. Nobody is going to touch because they have a code of honor. Compare that to San Francisco. People are bringing suitcases and suitcases, you know, stealing stuff openly because they know anything less than $900 will not be prosecuted. So the level of less police brutality in Japan is a tribute to the level of discipline and civilization in that society. If a society is inherently violent, in order to bring order, you will have to use state-sanctioned violence to bring order. Now, you know, I may be called very insensitive or maverick even, but there is a third law of thermodynamics. And that third law of thermodynamics states that in any closed system, the system tends to create to maximum amount of randomness and minimum amount of energy. So if you have to have more order and less randomness, you have to invest the system with more energy. So enthalpy and entropy of the system are inversely proportional to each other. And that may be true of, you know, physical systems or natural systems. But that third law of thermodynamics is also applicable to social systems. In order to maintain order in the society, you will have to invest that particular society with a lot of resources. And those resources are not just physical resources, but also law enforcement, right kind of law enforcement resources. But again, it depends upon the society we are talking. So I like this example of Japan. So I may say, you know, rather than doctrine of American exceptionalism, there's a doctrine of Japanese exceptionalism. You know, yes, there is crime in Japan. It's not that there's no crime in Japan. You know, everybody has heard about Yakuza and, you know, prostitution gangs and all that sort of thing. But gun crimes are minimal in Japan. You know, ordinary murders are very minimal in Japan. And there's a level of, you know, code of honor and things like that. So that's how that society protects itself from bad elements by having a code of honor. And that's why you have less police encounters, less police deaths, etc., etc. So issue of police brutality is very complex. Relationship between human rights and police brutality is also very complex. I think we should not forget that the police personnel also come from the society. They are a reflection of the society. They are not as, you know, foreign elements in the country where they are policing. they are an inherent part of the society. So sometimes the attitudes that police reflect are a reflection of the societal attitudes. You cannot divorce the two together. So problems are complex from an anthropological, socio-anthropological point of view. You should be able to look at each society as a participant observer, and look at the strengths and lacunae of that particular society. And yes, the United States stands apart, so does Japan. But if you have Second Amendment, I don't think that you will be able to have police force without lethal force. And that is the travesty here, that you want to reduce crime rates, but you want to have people who can carry automatic machine guns and gun people down. So there is a kind of ideological schizophrenia in the minds of the policy planners. What may have been true in 1776 is no longer true in 2022. So outdated rules, outdated regulation, outdated laws, which may have been relevant for society in 1776, may not be applicable to society in 2022. You have to modernize your thinking, you have to modernize your outlook, and not live in the past, because that is creating existential challenges for the society when you have kids being killed at random in school shootings and all that sort of thing. So level of violence in a society is reflective of that particular society. And sometimes there is no introspection and situation goes from bad to worse. But at least in democratic systems, you have opportunities to reform. And that is the hope one would learn from these seminars when you discuss issues threadbare, devoid of any ideological considerations, because there are ideological considerations on both left and right. And when we are looking at human rights, we are not looking at ideological considerations, but we are seeing what is good for the overall society, what is best for the common good of the society, rather than for one narrow section of the society. And abuse of freedoms always happens, so we have to be vigilant rather than just blaming the police. You have to see who are the people who are abusing the freedoms that have been bestowed, who are misusing the democratic system and taking it as a carte blanche for their narrow sectarian or narrow political or ethnic or racial agenda. So you have to have a balanced viewpoint, but it has been very good opportunity to discuss. Again, I'm thankful to you, Mr. Clemens, for stepping up to the plate and helping Ripudaman because of his particular situation at this point in time. As usual, these seminars are recorded. They would be available on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. Our next fellowship training seminar is scheduled for April 29th. And I think the topic for that discussion is slavery in 21st century. So Mr. Pichori, you can start preparing on that particular topic from now. Don't leave it to the end. And I hope that more and more people will join these seminars. Thank you, Christina, for joining. And I hope you are able to join more often. We understand your limitations. So even if you are able to join once a month or depending upon the topic of interest to you, and if at any point in time you want to present something or be a faculty preceptor, you're more than welcome. And lastly, we have a prospective candidate. Anushri, do you want to say anything or
Dhanyavad Adityanji. This was indeed very thought-provoking session for me. Since you have asked, the only example or the most startling example that comes to my mind is that of Chinese police brutality when it comes to human rights defenders protesting for their rights of self-determination in Tibet. Often they are subjected to police brutality, and this is something which I have been monitoring since 2010. So there are these issues of militarization of police and then dominance of one particular ethnicity in police group. And at the same time, the mood reason behind the protests by Tibetan minority in China is to draw the global attention, because there is a genuine fear of extinction of local native Tibetan culture and Tibetan way of life. And the extent of this protest sometimes goes up to self-immolation. And fearing the global ramification, what we see is the very heavy-handed clampdown by Chinese police on the protesters. So somewhere down the line, I mean, what I see is that the Marxist group in India, they would usually like to weaponize some lone instances of police brutality and make a case out of it. But at the same time, they would not even acknowledge the amount of police clampdown on the Tibetan activists in China. So it appears as if, although you have mentioned it very categorically, that this whole set of police responsiveness is more to do with the democratic regimes, and we do not usually consider the authoritarian regimes. But it appears as if the onus lies on the democratic regime, and possibly the authoritarian regime can go about its way.
Thank you, Anushri, for your observations and comments. We have covered actually the topics you have raised on police brutalities or, ethnic cleansing in Tibet under separate forums. China is a special case because it's an ideological sort of dictatorship. It's not a democracy, it's a totalitarian state. Yes, there is an ethnic component to that, but it does not matter when you were at Tiananmen Square. It did not matter whether you were Tibetan, you were Han, you were Manchurian, or you were Mongol. Everybody was slaughtered down because you were against the Communist Party. And that's happening even now. It's happening in Shanghai. Chinese police brutality against their own civilian population. It's happening in Hong Kong. So China is a special case by itself because it's not a democracy, and the superficial figures of policing are, 143 police personnel per 100,000 of population, because Chinese population itself is 1.4 billion. So proportionately, you have less police personnel, but the amount of police atrocities and brutalities are very high, and we will never know the true figures. We will never know the true figures, how many people were slaughtered during the Cultural Revolution time and the Great Leap Forward. We will never know, the number of people slaughtered in Tibet. So those police brutalities are continuing in China. And I think sometimes we need to study those closed totalitarian systems also, and not just focus on human rights, abuses by police and security forces in democratic setups, because they are very easy to criticize. And I discuss the complexities of societies. So I am glad that, all of us participated in here, and we hope to have your completed application, Anushri.
Yes.
Once your completed application comes, the selection process committee will process it, and we look forward to your detailed application. You are more than welcome to join our seminars even before you join the fellowship. And with those comments, I am going to close this seminar, and we shall meet again on April 29th, which is again a Friday, 9 p.m. Eastern Daytime, and it'll be 6:30 a.m. on Saturday in India. So with those, I thank all of you, especially Mr. Clemens, who rose to the occasion and did all the presentation by himself. And thanks a lot, everyone, and have a nice evening or morning. Okay.